The final word was delivered in a room that smelled of dry paper and settled dust. It was a cold, legal sound, stripped of mercy. Annalise Thorne sat perfectly still on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded over the worn fabric of her dress. She did not look at her brother-in-law, Franklin, but she could feel the heat of his satisfaction across the solicitor's heavy oak desk. He had won. The main homestead, the barns, the 100 acres of good pasture that her husband Thomas had built with his own 2 hands, it was all his now, secured by a clause in their father's will that favored a male heir in the absence of a direct son. Franklin had waited for Thomas's grave to be settled before he produced the document, his face a mask of solemn duty. Now, that mask had fallen away, revealing the glint of simple, unadorned greed. The solicitor cleared his throat, a dry rustle of a sound. As per the arrangement, Mr. Thorne has generously agreed to let you retain the old line cabin on the North Acreage, by Black Creek. And a stipend of $20 for your relocation. Annalise felt a tremor in her hands but willed it to stop. The line cabin was a ruin. A place for trappers to shelter from a sudden storm, nothing more. It had a crumbling hearth, a leaky roof, and 4 walls that leaned into each other for support. It was an insult disguised as charity. Franklin finally spoke, his voice coated in a thick layer of condescending pity. It is for the best, Annalise. A woman alone cannot possibly manage the main property. The work is too much. This is a respectable solution. You will be provided for. His words were stones dropped into a deep well of her grief. Provided for. She was being discarded. Pushed to the edge of the map where no one would have to look at her, the inconvenient widow. She finally raised her eyes and met his. They were small, confident eyes, certain of his place in the world and hers. She saw no flicker of doubt, no hint of shame. This was his right. He believed it. A strange calm settled over her. Arguing was pointless. Pleading was unthinkable. All that was left was a choice. She could take the $20 and disappear, or she could take the ruin. She chose the ruin. I will take the cabin, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not tremble. It was the first decision she had made as a widow, as a woman entirely alone. It was a choice to remain on the land Thomas had loved, even if it was the most forgotten, worthless piece of it. Franklin's lips tightened into a smirk of approval. He saw it as surrender. He could not see the seed of defiance taking root in the frozen ground of her heart. He saw a compliant woman accepting her fate. He did not see the survivor looking back at him, already calculating the cost of the coming winter. The journey to the cabin was a silent funeral procession for the life she had lost. She carried what little she could, a heavy quilt, a cast iron pot, a small sack of flour and dried beans, and Thomas's tools, an axe, a shovel, a sturdy pickaxe with a hickory handle worn smooth by his palms. Each step away from the warm, familiar shape of her home felt like a tearing of flesh. The line cabin was worse than she remembered. It sagged into the hillside as if the earth were trying to reclaim it. The single room was choked with the smell of rot and animal musk. Light streamed through gaps in the roof and walls, illuminating swirling dust motes. A cold wind, the harbinger of what was to come, whistled through the empty frame of the window opening, a mournful, unending note. For a full day, she did nothing but sit on the dirt floor, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders, and let the grief wash over her. It was a physical force, an icy tide that left her hollow and breathless. She mourned Thomas. She mourned the children they never had. She mourned the future that had been stolen from her, not by God, but by the casual cruelty of a man who shared her husband's blood. But as the second dawn broke, painting the grey sky with a faint, watery pink, something shifted. The grief remained, a permanent weight in her chest, but it was joined by something else, a cold, clear-eyed resolve. She would not die here. She would not give Franklin Thorne the satisfaction of finding her frozen body come spring. She stood up, her joints aching, and began to work. She started with the filth, sweeping out years of accumulated leaves and droppings with a makeshift broom of pine boughs. She patched the largest holes in the roof with pieces of bark and mud. She used clay from the creek bank to chink the walls, forcing it into every crack until her fingers were raw and caked with grime. The work was brutal, mindless, and it saved her. It gave her a place to put her anger and her sorrow. It turned the noise in her head into the simple, rhythmic sounds of labor, the scrape of wood, the slap of mud, the heavy thud of her own heart. The cabin was becoming hers, not through ownership, but through effort. Every patch, every sealed crack, was a testament to her refusal to break. One morning, as a sharp frost silvered every surface, she went down to Black Creek to fetch water. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and the edges of the creek were beginning to crust with ice. But in the center, the water still flowed, dark and swift. A thin plume of vapor, like a soft breath, rose from its surface. It was a spring-fed creek, Thomas had told her once. It came from deep in the earth, and so it never froze solid, not even in the coldest winters. She stared at the rising mist, and a memory surfaced, unbidden. It was of her father, a man who thought differently from others, a man who read the land like a book. He had once dug a deep cellar for their winter vegetables, far deeper than anyone else's, and it never frosted. The earth has a deep warmth, Annie, he had told her, his hand smelling of soil. It holds the memory of summer long after the air has forgotten. The idea arrived not as a flash of lightning, but as a slow, creeping dawn. The creek held the earth's warmth. A constant, reliable source of it, flowing right past her door. If she could somehow bring that warmth, however slight, closer to her cabin, it might be enough. Enough to keep the killing cold at bay. She looked from the steaming creek to the sagging cabin, and the distance between them seemed immense, an impossible chasm. The ground was hard, already stiffening with the coming frost, filled with rocks and roots. The vision that formed in her mind was monstrous in its scale, a trench. A deep, long trench, running from the bank of the creek, uphill, straight to her cabin, and then underneath it. A covered channel that would allow the air, warmed by the flowing water, to travel under her floor. It was a mad thought. The work of 10 men, not one woman with a shovel and a broken heart. It would take weeks, maybe months. Weeks she didn't have. The first snows were already dusting the high peaks. Anyone would have called it impossible. Franklin would have laughed, a loud, booming laugh that would echo in the silent woods. And it was in that imagined sound of his mockery that Annalise found her strength. The madness of the idea was its salvation. No one would expect it. No one would understand it. It would be her secret, whispered between her, the earth, and the ghost of her husband. She walked back to the cabin, picked up Thomas's shovel, and felt its familiar weight in her hands. She went to the spot where the cabin floor was lowest and struck the ground. The metal rang against the hard soil. The sound was small, but final. It was the sound of her war beginning. The first week was a testament to pain. Annalise's body, already worn thin by grief, screamed in protest. The muscles in her back and shoulders burned with a fire that never went out. Her hands, soft from a life of tending a home, were ripped raw within the first day. Blisters formed, broke, and bled, leaving weeping sores that she grimly wrapped in strips of cloth. She learned to work through the agony, to find a rhythm that her body could sustain. Dig, lift, toss. Dig, lift, toss. The pile of dark earth beside the growing gash in the ground grew with excruciating slowness. Each shovelful felt like a victory. Each new foot of trench, a conquest. She worked from the first hint of dawn until the light failed, stopping only to drink from the creek and eat a handful of cold beans. The physical exhaustion was a mercy, it left no room for the deeper exhaustion of her sorrow. At night, she would collapse onto her pallet, too tired to dream, and wake in the dark, stiff and sore, to begin again. The earth fought back. She hit shale that sent jarring vibrations up her arms, forcing her to use the heavy pickaxe, swinging it until her shoulders felt dislocated. She fought with thick, stubborn roots, hacking at them with the axe, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The trench had to be deep, at least for feet, to be safe from the surface frost. And it had to be precise, sloping gently upwards from the creek to the cabin to encourage the natural flow of the warmer air. She was not just digging a ditch, she was engineering her own survival. She learned the language of the soil. The soft, dark loam near the creek gave way to dense clay, then to a stubborn layer of gravel and rock. She was unearthing the history of the land, one painful inch at a time. The world shrank until it was composed only of the trench, the shovel, her aching body, and the relentless passage of the sun across the sky. She felt herself becoming harder, leaner. The softness was burning away, leaving behind something tough and resilient, like old leather. She was no longer just Thomas Thorne's widow. She was the woman who was digging to the creek. She did not know if her plan would work. The physics of it existed only in her head, a fragile theory based on a wisp of steam and a half-remembered conversation. But every day, the trench grew longer, a dark, determined scar on the landscape, and with it, her hope, fragile but persistent, grew too. One afternoon, the rhythmic scrape of her shovel was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Annalise paused, leaning on the shovel's handle, and watched as two riders emerged from the trees. It was Franklin, and with him was Mr. Davies, the head of the town council. They reined in their horses at the edge of the clearing, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Franklin surveyed the scene, the patched-up cabin, the woman covered in dirt, and the long, seemingly pointless trench. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. "Annalise," he called out, his voice carrying an edge of mock concern. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" She did not answer immediately, simply watched him, her eyes narrowed. She wiped a smear of mud from her brow with the back of her wrist, leaving a dirty streak. "I am working," she said, her voice flat. Davies squinted at the trench. "It appears you are digging a grave, Mrs. Thorne." A rather long 1 inch, he chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. Franklin joined in. "Perhaps she intends to bury the past," he said, looking pointedly at Davies, inviting him to share the joke. "Or maybe she's lost her senses out here all alone." Grief does strange things to the fairer sex. The words were meant to sting, to remind her of her place, a fragile, emotional creature, now unmoored without a man to guide her. Annalise's grip tightened on the shovel handle. She could feel the rough grain of the wood, the same wood Thomas's hands had shaped. She thought of a dozen sharp replies, words that would wipe the smugness from their faces. But she said none of them. To explain would be to invite more ridicule, to give them power over her idea. Her silence was a better weapon. "I have my reasons," she said, her voice low and even. Franklin shook his head, a theatrical display of disappointment. "This is not dignified. A Thorne woman, digging in the dirt like a common laborer. You are embarrassing the family name. Take the $20 I offered. Go to the city. Find some respectable work as a seamstress. I am where I belong," she replied, and the simple finality in her tone seemed to momentarily unnerve him. He exchanged a look with Davies, a look that said, "She is lost. There is no helping her." "Very well," Franklin said, his voice turning cold. "Do not come to me when the snows fall and you find yourself starving. You have made your choice. We will not be responsible." They turned their horses and rode away, their backs straight and self-righteous. Annalise watched them go until they were swallowed by the trees. She stood alone in the vast silence, the sound of their laughter still hanging in the cold air. Then, she bent down, drove the shovel into the hard earth, and got back to work. Their scorn had not broken her. It had tempered her resolve into steel. The trench was only the first part of the construction. Now, she had to build the conduit. She spent days searching the woods for flat, heavy stones, prying them from the earth and hauling them back one by one on a makeshift sledge of bark. She lined the bottom and sides of the trench with these stones, creating a smooth, stable channel. The work was even more demanding than the digging, a puzzle of weight and balance. Her hands grew calloused and strong, her movements economical and sure. For the top of the channel, she needed something to form a roof. She felled several dead, dry pines, the sharp crack of the axe echoing in the silent forest. She was not a woodcutter, and the work was clumsy and dangerous, but she learned. She learned to read the lean of a tree, to make her cuts clean and deep. She trimmed the logs and split them, laying them across the top of the stone-lined trench, fitting them together as tightly as she could. A layer of pine boughs went over the logs, and then, painstakingly, she began to backfill the trench, returning the earth she had excavated. She was burying her work, hiding it from view. To any observer, it would soon look as though the ground had never been disturbed, save for a small, stone-lined opening at the creek's edge and another that disappeared directly under the foundation of her cabin. While she labored on the trench, she also prepared for the siege of winter in more conventional ways. She gathered firewood until she had a stack taller than she was, a dense wall of fuel against the coming cold. She foraged for the last of the season's nuts and dried berries. She sealed the window opening not with some delicate pain, but with a tightly stretched deer hide she traded for with a passing trapper, making the interior of the cabin dark and cave-like, but secure against the wind. The air grew colder each day. The sun was a pale, distant disk that offered little warmth. The birds had fallen silent. The world was holding its breath, waiting. Annalise worked with a frantic, focused energy, racing against the inevitable. She felt the pressure of the coming season like a physical weight on her shoulders. There was no room for error, no time for rest. Her survival depended entirely on her own foresight and the strength of her own two hands. As she packed the last layer of soil over the hidden channel, a single, perfect snowflake drifted down and melted on the back of her hand. It was a warning. Time was up. The storm did not arrive gently. It came like an invading army, a wall of white that consumed the sky and blotted out the mountains. The wind shrieked, a high, keening sound that tore at the little cabin, testing every patch and seam. Snow fell not in flakes but in a blinding, horizontal torrent. Annalise huddled inside, the disk in over the window shuddering with each new gust. The darkness was almost absolute, broken only by the flickering light of her small fire in the hearth. The cold was a living thing, a predator pressing in from all sides. It forced its way through the tiniest cracks, a constant, insidious pressure. She stuffed every remaining gap with moss and rags, but still, the chill seeped in. The fire provided a small circle of warmth, but a few feet away, the air was frigid. Water in a bucket near the door quickly developed a skin of ice. For 2 days, the blizzard raged without pause. The world outside her door ceased to exist, replaced by a swirling vortex of white. The sound of the wind was relentless, a physical assault on the senses that wore down the spirit. She rationed her firewood, keeping the fire just large enough to stave off the worst of the cold. She ate sparingly, listening to the storm, feeling the immense, indifferent power of nature trying to reclaim her small pocket of existence. In the town, it was a different kind of siege. They had sturdy houses, deep cellars, and great stores of wood. But they had never seen a cold like this. It was a dry, piercing cold that seemed to ignore walls and fires. It found its way into pantries, freezing jars of preserves until they shattered. It crept into cellars, turning potatoes and apples into solid blocks of ice. The ink froze in the wells on their desks. The lard hardened to the consistency of rock in their kitchens. Franklin Thorne sat in his large, well-built house, a thick blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and watched his breath plume in the air of his own study. The great fire roaring in his hearth seemed to produce no heat. It was being swallowed by the immense cold of the house itself. His wife and 2 small children were huddled in one room, bundled in every blanket they owned, their faces pale and pinched. The town had shut down. No one could move. Each house was an isolated island of shivering misery, their confidence and preparation proving utterly useless against the sheer, brutal reality of the freeze. They were trapped, not by the snow, but by the cold itself. On the 3rd day of the storm, the wind finally died down. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the landscape. Annalise cautiously unbarred her door and pushed it open against a drift of snow. The world was remade, an ocean of white under a steel-gray sky. The cold was even more intense now, a still, clean, razor-sharp chill that felt like it could crack bone. She took a breath and the air burned in her lungs. She looked back inside her small, dark cabin. It was not warm. It was not comfortable. But it was survivable. The air was cold, but it lacked the vicious, biting edge of the air outside. She walked to the center of the room and placed her bare hand on the packed dirt floor, directly above where she knew the hidden channel ran. The ground was cold, of course. But it was the cold of a deep cellar, not the frozen, crystalline cold of the surface. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible difference, an absence of frost. Her trench was working. It wasn't a furnace. It wasn't heating her cabin. It was simply bleeding the worst of the frost out of the foundation, using the constant, 50-degree temperature of the spring-fed creek to keep the ground beneath her from freezing solid. It was enough. The water in her bucket was liquid. Her small store of potatoes in the corner was firm, not frozen. The fire in her hearth, now fed with a little more wood, was able to hold its own against the chill, creating a small, livable space. She was enduring. Meanwhile, in Franklin's grand house, disaster had struck. A pipe, frozen solid despite being indoors, had burst. His youngest son had fallen ill, his breathing shallow and ragged in the suffocating cold of their bedroom. The doctor was unreachable, trapped in his own frozen home. Franklin's authority, his wealth, his social standing, all of it was meaningless. He was just a man in a cold room, watching his child suffer, helpless against an enemy he could not sue or intimidate. Panic, cold and sharp as an icicle, began to pierce through his arrogance. He had firewood, yes, but the house was too large, too full of drafts. It was a magnificent trap. He thought of the other families, all in the same state, their meticulously planned larders now frozen ruins. Then, an image came to him, Annalise, covered in dirt, digging her pointless, mad trench. He had laughed at her. But she was out there, in that flimsy shack. If she was still alive, she was living in the very heart of this freeze. How was that possible? The question began to haunt him, a tiny, unsettling flicker of doubt in the frozen certainty of his world. A man named Peters, a trapper who lived on the edge of town, was the first to make it out. Driven by a dwindling woodpile, he had fought his way through the deep drifts, checking his lines. He was nearing Black Creek when he saw a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney of the old line cabin. He assumed he was seeing a ghost. No one could be alive out here, not in this cold. He approached with caution, his rifle ready. What he found stunned him. He saw Annalise Thorne, wrapped in a heavy cloak, calmly clearing a path from her door. She was moving slowly, deliberately, not like someone on the edge of freezing. He called out, his voice hoarse. She looked up, unsurprised. He stumbled closer, half frozen, his beard caked in ice. "Mrs. Thorne? How are you?" "Alive." She offered him a cup of hot, weak tea by her fire. The cabin was cold, but the air didn't hurt to breathe. He felt the life slowly seep back into his frozen limbs. He saw her unfrozen water bucket, the small pile of edible roots that weren't hard as rocks. It made no sense. His own cabin, far better built, was an icebox. "How?" he asked again, his voice filled with awe. She explained it simply. The creek. The trench. The earth's warmth. He listened, his eyes wide, the sheer, brilliant simplicity of it stunning him. It was the kind of wisdom the land offered, but that most people had forgotten how to hear. He left her cabin a different man. He fought his way back to town, not for his woodpile, but with a message. He went straight to Franklin Thorne's house. He found a desperate man, his face gray with fear. Franklin's son was now burning with fever. "She's alive," Peters gasped, bursting into the frigid home. "Annalise." "She's alive and well." Franklin stared at him. "That's impossible." "She dug a trench," Peters said, breathing heavily. "From the creek. Under her cabin. It keeps the frost away. It works, Mr. Thorne. I felt it. The place is not warm, but it is not frozen. It is alive." The words hung in the icy air. Franklin looked at his sick child, then at the frost covering the inside of his own walls. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. While he had been sitting in his fine house, wrapped in legal papers and self-importance, his foolish, grieving sister-in-law had been listening to the land. She had prepared not with arrogance, but with intelligence. And she had survived. He, the man of status and power, had failed. His pride crumbled, turning to ash in his mouth. There was only one choice left. He had to go to her. He had to ask for help from the woman he had thrown away. The journey was an act of pilgrimage and desperation. Franklin, Peters, and 2 other men from the town council set out for the Line cabin. They moved through a world of brutal, silent white. The snow was waist-deep, the effort of each step immense. The cold was relentless, sucking the strength from their bodies. For Franklin, every agonizing step was an act of penance. He was walking away from the symbols of his power, his big house, his title, and toward the one person who had seen through his fragile authority. He was going to beg. They saw the cabin, a small, dark shape against the snow, the wisp of smoke from its chimney a flag of defiance in the frozen world. They stumbled into the clearing, their faces raw from the wind, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and cold. Annalise heard them coming. She stood in the doorway of her cabin, the shovel in her hand. She watched them approach, for broken men, their pride stripped away by the unsparing cold. Franklin stood before her, his fine wool coat failing to hide his shivering. He couldn't meet her eyes. He looked at the packed earth at her feet, the same earth he had mocked her for digging. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken history. Annalise, he finally managed to say, his voice a ragged whisper. The name was an admission of defeat. He didn't use the condescending sister-in-law, he used her name. My son. He is sick. Our houses. They are tombs of ice. We were wrong. He finally lifted his head, and in his eyes, she saw not arrogance, but pure, unvarnished fear. Please, he said. Help us. Tell us what you did the moment hung in the balance. She held all the power. She could have turned them away. She could have savored the reversal, paid him back for every humiliation. She could have recited his own words back to him, do not come to me when the snows fall. You have made your choice. But when she looked at his face, she saw not just the man who had wronged her, but a father terrified for his child. Her victory did not need to be cruel. It only needed to be acknowledged. She stepped aside from the doorway. Come in, she said, her voice steady. The fire is small, but it is burning. It was not forgiveness. It was something far more powerful. It was grace. They crowded into the small, dim space, and the relative shelter from the killing cold was so profound it felt like a miracle. They looked around at the unfrozen bucket, the simple, functional shelter, and they understood. This was not magic. This was wisdom. Annalise let them warm themselves, and then, in the quiet of her cabin, with the 4 most powerful men in town listening like school children, she began to explain the simple physics of the earth, the creek, and the cold. The transfer of knowledge had begun. The balance of power in the valley had shifted forever.